She stood alone while everyone whispered. The ballroom of Ashworth Hall blazed with candlelight, the chandeliers dripping crystal and flame, but Alara Blackwood stood in a corner that felt like winter. She was the new Duchess of Thornwood, yet not a single soul approached her. They circled like elegant wolves, their fans fluttering, their eyes sharp with amusement. "The debt bride," someone murmured behind a silk glove. "His Grace only married her because of an old promise. She's practically a servant with a title." Another laugh, light as poison honey. "Look at her gown. She tries so hard, poor thing, but breeding cannot be stitched into velvet." Alara's fingers curled against the cool stone of the pillar at her back. The emerald velvet gown had been chosen because she once overheard the Duke say green was a noble color. She had wanted to please him. She had been so foolish. Now she felt like a child playing dress-up, every seam a reminder that she did not belong. Across the room, her husband stood with his back to her, his shoulders broad and unyielding. Alden Blackwood, the Duke of Thornwood, was deep in conversation with Lady Genevieve Ashford, a golden-haired widow whose laughter tinkled like crystal chimes. She touched his arm. He did not move away. He had not looked at Alara once since they descended from the carriage except to issue a quiet command. "Remain composed. Do not embarrass this house." Not our house. His house. The house that had swallowed her whole 3 months ago. Alara pressed her palm flat against the stone until it ached. She had imagined this night for weeks, hoping it might mark a change, a chance to stand beside him as his wife. Instead, she was a ghost at the feast. She watched Lady Genevieve lean closer, and something inside Alara splintered. She turned and slipped through the terrace doors, the night air sharp and honest against her cheeks. She gripped the balustrade and let the tears fall where no one could see. She was 21 years old, and she had already learned that hope was a wound that refused to heal. She had arrived at Thornwood Hall on a gray October morning, the sky weeping a cold drizzle. In her hands, a letter stained with her father's fatting script. Arthur Vance had been a botanist of quiet brilliance, a man who understood the language of roots and petals better than the language of people. When the young Duke of Thornwood was thrown from his horse 8 years ago, feverish and dying in a remote village, it was Arthur who had ridden through the night, who had crushed the rare yarrow and pressed it to the wound, who had brewed the tonic that pulled the poison from his blood. In gratitude, the Duke had written a vow, any favor, any time for the Vance family. Alara's mother had died long ago. When her father's heart finally failed, leaving her with nothing but debt and a small cottage that would soon be seized, she remembered that vow. She wrote to the Duke, expecting nothing. He sent for her. She arrived hopping for shelter. She received a cold, swift marriage and a silent partner who looked at her as if she were a column in his ledger. The wedding was a private affair, witnessed by a handful of servants and a somber chaplain. Alden recited his vows in a monotone, his gray eyes fixed somewhere above her head. That evening, he showed her to a chamber on the opposite side of the manor from his own. "You will have everything you need," he said, as if arranging a guest's comfort. Then he left. The door between their lives remained firmly closed. In those first fragile weeks, Alara tried. She learned his schedule. She made certain the tea was hot when he returned from riding. She placed fresh flowers from the garden in his study, arranging them with nervous care. She asked about his day, his tenants, his thoughts. His answers were never cruel, but they were empty. "Fine. No, if you wish." He never asked about hers. One evening, she gathered every scrap of courage and reached across the dinner table to touch his hand. He flinched as if burned, pulled back, and muttered something about accounts needing attention. He left her sitting alone with the cooling soup, and she never tried again. The herb garden became her sanctuary. She found it while wandering the west wing, a forgotten tangle of brambles and dying shrubs tucked behind a crumbling wall. It had once been the pride of the Duke's grandmother, a medicinal garden filled with rare plants. Now it lay choked with weeds, but here and there she saw lavender struggling for light, rosemary clinging to life, the pale green shoots of chamomile. She knelt in the cold earth, pulled on a pair of old gloves stored in a shed, and began to work. The rhythm of pulling weeds, of turning soil, of breathing the green scent of crushed leaves, was the first real comfort she had known since her father died. She remembered his voice teaching her each plant's secret: feverfew for the aching head, yarrow to staunch a wound, valerian to soothe a troubled mind. In that garden she felt him close. She worked until her back ached and her hands blistered, and when she finally stood, the garden seemed to exhale with her. Servants watched her with curiosity, then something warmer: the Duchess with dirt on her cheeks, the Duchess who talked to the plants. Then a footman's daughter burned her hand on a kettle, and Alara took the child into the kitchen and spread a cooled aloe salve over the angry red skin. The girl stopped crying. The footman, a gruff man named Thomas, looked at her with something like reverence. Word spread. A farmer's wife with a cough that would not quit, a shepherd's son with a rash that no physician could cure. They came to the kitchen door with shy knocks and worn faces, and Alara never refused them. She brewed, she bandaged, she listened. The tenants began to call her the Green Duchess, and when she walked through the village, children ran to her with wildflowers clutched in their small fists. The Duke remained oblivious, sealed in his study with estate ledgers, his brow perpetually furrowed. He did not visit the garden. He did not ask about the tenants. He moved through the manor like a shadow of duty, and Alara moved like a shadow of patience, and the two shadows never touched. Then came a night that sparked a foolish, desperate hope. The Duke hosted a dinner for local gentry, and Alara sat at the far end of the table, a painted smile on her face. A portly magistrate, deep in his cups, gestured toward her with a greasy laugh. "It must be a comfort, Your Grace, to have a wife so practiced in mending stockings. Common blood does have its uses, eh?" The table tittered nervously. Alara's cheeks burned. Before she could draw breath, the Duke set down his glass with a crack that silenced the room. "You forget yourself, sir. You speak of the Duchess of Thornwood. Apologize or leave this hall and do not return." The magistrate paled, stammered an apology, and the conversation limped forward. Alara's heart hammered. He had defended her. He had called her the Duchess of Thornwood with steel in his voice. That night hope gave her wings. She followed him to his study, her hands clasped to still their trembling. "Thank you," she said softly from the doorway, "for defending me." He did not turn from the window. The firelight cast his face in sharp angles. "I defended the title. Your conduct reflects on the Blackwood name. Do not mistake duty for affection." The words were a door slamming shut, a key turning in a lock. She stood there for a long moment, the wings of hope folding and crumbling to dust. Then she walked away, and something inside her began to close. After that night, Alara changed. She stopped setting flowers on his desk. She stopped waiting up for his return. She took her meals earlier or later, often on a tray in the garden with a book. Her gowns became simpler, cotton and wool, suited for kneeling in soil and walking muddy lanes. She no longer consulted fashion plates or asked her maid to dress her hair in elaborate styles. She twisted it into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. When she passed the Duke in the corridor, she curtsied politely, murmured "Good day, Your Grace," and continued on. She did not pause. She did not search his face for a flicker of warmth. She no longer cried herself to sleep. The tears had dried, replaced by a quiet, hollow acceptance. She had come to Thornwood as a debt to be paid, and she would live as one until she found a way to live for herself. The Duke noticed the silence before he understood its meaning. At first, it was a faint irritation. The manor felt different. The evenings were quieter, yes, but not in a peaceful way. It was a waiting silence, a held breath. He found himself listening for her footsteps in the hall. He caught himself glancing toward the garden from the library window. One evening he sat down to dinner at the usual hour and the table was empty. He waited 10 minutes, then summoned the housekeeper. "Where is her Grace?" "She dined an hour ago, Your Grace. She is in the village. The blacksmith's son has a fever." He dismissed her, and the food on his plate lost its taste. 4 days later, he realized she had not spoken to him beyond good morning and good evening in a week. Her absence began to press on him like a stone on his chest. He took to standing at the west window in the afternoons. From there he could see the herb garden. She was always there, kneeling in a plain brown dress, her hands deep in the soil. She looked peaceful, he thought. She looked like she belonged to the earth itself and not to him. The thought cut deeper than he expected. He would turn away, angry at himself, but the next day he would find himself at the window again. Then Sir Oliver Hawthorne arrived. The young baronet was a naturalist, spectacles perched on his nose, a boyish enthusiasm lighting his face. He had come to discuss a boundary dispute, but when he saw the restored herb garden, he forgot all about property lines. He found Alara trimming rosemary and introduced himself with a delighted exclamation about the rare variety she had cultivated. They spoke for an hour, their conversation a dance of Latin plant names and botanical theories. Alara's eyes, so long dull, sparked with interest. Sir Oliver asked if he might return with a book on Himalayan medicinal plants. She smiled, a real smile, the first the Duke had seen in months, and said yes. The Duke watched from the library window, his hand tightening on the curtain until his knuckles whitened. He told himself it was possessiveness. She was his wife, his duchess, and the baronet's attention was unseemly. But that night he could not sleep. He walked to the garden in the moonlight and found a pair of her gardening gloves left on a bench. He picked them up, held the worn fabric in his hands, and a hollow ache spread through his chest. He was beginning to understand that he had built a cage for her, and now he was trapped inside it with his own silence. Sir Oliver's visits became regular. He brought rare seeds, sketches of exotic flowers, a beautifully illustrated herbal from Italy. He and Alara walked the garden paths, their heads bent together in animated discussion. He listened to her with genuine respect, asked her opinions, laughed at her quiet jokes. The tenants noticed the baronet's attention and gossiped among themselves. The Duke heard the whispers from his steward. Jealousy, hot and unfamiliar, coiled in his gut. He began to find reasons to interrupt them. "The steward requires you, Sir Oliver. The east pasture fence needs inspection." The baronet would bow politely and withdraw, but his eyes lingered on Alara with unmasked admiration. She, for her part, seemed unaware, or more painfully, unconcerned. One afternoon, Sir Oliver lingered after a particularly long interruption. The Duke had retreated to his study, but he could still see them from the window. The baronet was holding a small velvet pouch. "Lady Blackwood, I have something for you," Oliver said, his voice carrying on the breeze. "It is a position, if you wish it. A circle of naturalists in London is forming a society dedicated to medicinal botany. They have read the monograph I sent them based on your work. I took the liberty of transcribing some of your observations. They are eager to meet you. There would be a stipend, a small house, and the freedom to pursue your research. You would be honored for your own merit, not as anyone's debt." He pressed the pouch into her hand. Inside was a letter of invitation, embossed with a botanical society's seal. Alara stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Freedom, recognition, a life where her worth was not measured by a cold marriage contract. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Say you will consider it," Sir Oliver said gently. "You do not have to decide today, but you deserve a life where you are seen, Alara, truly seen." She nodded slowly, and the Duke, watching from the window, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. That evening he confronted her in the corridor. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual composure. "What is he to you? The baronet. He offers you a life away from here, does he not?" Alara met his gaze without flinching. "He offers me a chance to be valued for who I am. He is a friend, something I have few of." "I am your husband," the Duke said, the words catching in his throat. Her expression did not soften. "You have not been my husband in any way that matters, your grace. You are the man to whom I am a debt. I have paid it with my silence, my solitude, and my hope. There is nothing left. Do not ask me to refuse an escape from a prison you built." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. That night Alden Blackwood sat alone in his study, a decanter of brandy untouched. He replayed her words over and over. A prison he built. He had done that. He thought of the early days, the flowers she had placed on his desk, the tentative touch of her hand, the way she used to look at him with something soft and hopeful. He had recoiled from all of it, afraid. Years ago, a woman named Marguerite had accepted his proposal, only to abandon him for a wealthier duke. He had sworn never to be vulnerable again, and so he had punished Alara for another woman's betrayal. The realization sickened him. He had made her feel like a transaction, a burden, a ghost, and now she was planning to leave. The next morning, driven by a desperate need to understand, he went to the storage room where her few belongings were kept. He found a small trunk bearing her father's initials. Inside, beneath dried flowers and botanical journals, lay a leather-bound volume. He opened it and began to read Arthur Vance's neat script, descriptions of plants, experiments, weather patterns. Then a passage stopped his heart. The young Lord Blackwood was brought to us pale as death. Infection had set in deep. I prepared the poultice, but it was Alara, only 12 years old, who first found him in the ditch, who tore the cloth and pressed the wound. She held his hand through the fever, singing to him. I believe her voice kept him tethered to this world. I merely finished what she began. The book trembled in his hands. She had saved him, not just her father. She had held his hand and sung to him. A faint, half-forgotten memory stirred, a soft voice, a cool hand on his brow, a blur of a child's face. He had carried that memory for years, thinking it a fevered dream. It was her. Beneath the journal, in a velvet pouch, he found a silver locket, his mother's locket engraved with ivy. He had given it to Arthur Vance as a token of thanks, pressing it into the botanist's hand and saying, "For your daughter." He had never known the girl's name. All this time, Alara had worn it. He had seen it around her neck on their wedding day, a flash of silver, but he had been too consumed with his own resentment to truly see. He sank onto a dusty trunk, the locket cold in his palm, and a grief unlike any he had known crashed over him. He had been blind, cruelly, utterly blind. The girl who had saved his life, the woman who had tried to love him, he had treated as an unwanted obligation. He sought her out immediately, but she was in the village. A messenger had arrived with urgent news. A fever was spreading through the cottages. The blacksmith's son was worse, and others were falling ill. Alara had gathered her supplies and gone without a word. The Duke rode after her, his heart a drum of fear. He found her in a cramped, smoky cottage, a child in her lap, her face pale with exhaustion. She barely glanced at him. "There is a sickness. I need yarrow, clean water, and every willing pair of hands." He did not hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves and worked beside her. For 3 days the Duke of Thornwood fetched water, boiled rags, carried firewood, and held feverish children while his Duchess spooned tinctures and whispered comfort. The villagers stared in disbelief, then gratitude. They saw their proud, cold lord humbling himself in the mud, his fine coat discarded, his hands raw. And they saw the way he watched Alara, not as a burden but as a lifeline. She moved through the cottages with a calm, tireless grace, her voice gentle, her touch sure. She was everything he had failed to see. But the fever was relentless. It claimed the elderly Mrs. Croft, then the miller's youngest son. Alara did not stop. She refused food, refused rest, until finally on the 4th morning she stumbled in the doorway of a cottage and fell to her knees. The Duke caught her as she crumpled, her skin burning, her body trembling with the same savage fever she had fought in others. He shouted for help, his voice cracking with terror. He carried her back to Thornwood Hall himself, his legs straining, his breath ragged. He laid her in her chamber, the chamber he had never entered, and refused to leave. The physician came. He bled her, applied compresses, shook his head grimly. The fever raged. Her skin was fire, her lips cracked, her breath shallow. For 3 days and 3 nights the Duke kept vigil. He held her hand, bathed her forehead with cool water, and talked. He talked as he had never talked in his life. He told her about Marguerite, about the scar of betrayal that had made him a coward. He told her how he had stood at the altar and felt something stir when he saw her, but crushed it out of fear. He confessed that he had been secretly funding the greenhouse, the apothecary, the medical supplies, all of it, because he believed in her work, because he wanted to support her, because he did not know how to show love except by silently giving. He told her about the journal, about the locket, about the little girl who had sung to him and saved his life. "It was you, Alara. All along it was you. I loved you too late, please. I cannot lose you now. I cannot live in a world where you are a ghost." On the 3rd night, when the fever seemed to tighten its grip and her breathing grew fainter, he pressed her hand to his lips and wept. The tears fell onto her fingers and his voice broke into a whisper. "I am sorry. For every cold word, every silence, every moment I made you feel like a debt. You were never my debt. You were my gift, my heart, my home. Come back to me." A tremor ran through her hand. Her fingers twitched, then curled around his. When the gray dawn light crept through the curtains, her eyes opened. They were glassy but lucid. She looked at him, the stubble on his jaw, the dark hollows under his eyes, the desperate hope naked on his face. "Alden," she breathed. His name spoken in her voice was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. "I am here." His voice cracked like thin ice. "I heard you," she said, her words slow and fragile. "The girl, the locket, the garden supplies." He nodded, unable to speak. "I wanted you to know me," she continued, a tear slipping into her hair. "Not for duty, for myself." "I know you now," he said fiercely, his hand cradling hers as if she were spun glass. "I know your strength, your kindness, your stubborn, beautiful courage. I know the woman who healed the children, who stopped waiting for a love I was too broken to give. If you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life giving it. Every day, every hour." She closed her eyes, and for a terrible moment he feared she had slipped away. Then her hand squeezed his, weakly but deliberately. "No more silence," she whispered. "No more," he promised, his forehead touching her knuckles. "Never again." Her recovery was slow, but he did not leave her side. He read to her from her father's journals, laughing softly at Arthur's witty asides about stubborn plants and stubborn dukes. When she was strong enough to sit up, he carried her to the garden, wrapping her in blankets against the spring chill. They talked for hours, about the estate's financial strain, about her dream of expanding the medicinal herb trade, about his fears of failure and her fears of being unseen. He showed her the accounts, the hidden expenditures he had made for her work. She took his hand, her touch gentle but steady. "We will rebuild together. You are not alone anymore." And the last frozen wall around his heart melted into spring. Sir Oliver visited one last time, a month later. He found them sitting together on the garden bench, her head resting on Alden's shoulder, the Duke's arm wrapped around her with a protective tenderness that spoke of everything words could not. The baronet smiled, a little wistfully, and when Alara introduced him to her husband with a quiet, joyful pride, Sir Oliver bowed and took his leave. He was a good man, and he wished her well. That summer Thornwood Hall transformed. The herb garden bloomed richer than ever, its neat rows of lavender and chamomile, foxglove and valerian, a testament to patience and care. Alara, fully healed, taught the tenants how to cultivate medicinal plants, and the Duke worked alongside her, his hands now as calloused and dirt-stained as hers. His laughter, once so rare, rang across the fields. The villagers spoke of them with affection and wonder, the Green Duchess and the Duke who had learned to love. The village apothecary became a thriving concern, its tinctures and salves sold as far as the next county, easing the estate's debts and bringing a quiet prosperity. But more than money, it brought partnership, purpose, a shared life. One evening, as the sun set in ribbons of rose and gold, they stood on the terrace overlooking the garden. He turned to her, his gray eyes soft as mist. "When I think of how close I came to losing you, I cannot breathe." She reached up and touched his cheek, her palm warm against his skin. "You did lose me for a time, but you found me again." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and earth. "I will never stop finding you. Every day, Alara. Every single day." She smiled against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. The heart that had been silent for so long, now speaking a language only she could hear. The debt that had brought them together was paid 100 times over, not in coin, but in quiet looks, shared laughter, and the steady, unwavering commitment of two souls who had wandered through the dark and found each other at last. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood became known not for a cold bargain, but for a love story told in drawing rooms and cottage hearths alike. A love born from obligation, tested by silence, and redeemed by a girl who once saved a boy in a ditch, and a man who finally learned to speak the words his heart had always known. And every night in the quiet of their shared chamber, he would murmur against her hair, "I loved you too late, but I will love you well." And she would answer, her voice filled with the peace of home, "Then it is just in time." The debt was gone, the silence broken, and in its place bloomed a love that would never fade.